Hi, my name is Luis Jimenez. It's a pleasure being here. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Brown CKC, an international regulatory consulting firm. And it's a pleasure to just host this amazing panel. I am looking forward to a lot of takeaways. When we were envisioning the panel, we thought it would be good to give each person some time to talk about their respective organizations and to introduce the topic. So we'll go through the panelists, and each one will show you a little bit about what the world is like. But to introduce the topic, I wanted to just highlight COVID has disrupted technology commercialization tremendously. It also has provided new pathways to market. During this panel session, we will hear the latest information updates on the clinical trial landscape during COVID-19 global pandemic. We aim to provide insights about challenges and opportunities for entrepreneurial ventures going forward. And as I mentioned, we'll be hearing from experts in the clinical research and regulatory affairs as they share their thoughts on how COVID has impacted pre- and post-market trials for drugs, devices, and diagnostics. Not because this is a person in the latest time zone, but we just thought we'd start with Danielle Giroud. Danielle is the founder and CEO of MD Clinicals. She has over 20 years of experience, is a great good friend, and is a founder and senior faculty board member of the World Medical Device Organization. She's regarded as a recognized clinical research and regulatory expert within the medical device industry, and having shared her experience, her extensive knowledge and experience with multinational corporations. She is also famously also the convener of the expert group on clinical investigations at a global level, the Working Group 194 for ISO 14155, as well as the liaison with the European Commission for Clinical Investigation Evaluation Task Force. So with that, I was going to hand it over to Danielle to provide a little introduction on her organization and tee up the discussion, recent trends on clinical trials. Let's see. If you wanted to share your slides too, Danielle.
I was going to ask, are my slides somewhere up and running? I'm just not having a stable network here.
Okay.
Can Sam pull them up, or is that too difficult?
Why don't you start introducing yourself while Sam pulls that up? Oh, there you go.
Oh, there they are. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the last minute thing. So yeah, Danielle Giroud. Luis, you just introduced myself perfectly, so I'm not going to add anything to this. I've been around for a while in the clinical arena, mostly and mainly for devices. I don't know a lot about pharmaceutical trials, but I do know everything about medical device trials. I always say I'm a device girl. So I'm the CEO of MD Clinicals, and you can just move to the next slide, which is an international CRO for medical devices. We only do medical devices. We're very passionate about medical devices. And we have more than 30 years experience running clinical trials, but also developing strategies for clinical trials for medical device startups or even larger companies. And these days we develop strategies, and obviously in developing these strategies, we get always the question, what about getting a study started in Europe, Danielle? Is that possible during this COVID period of time? So next slide. So we are a global company. We're certified 9001. But we do work we do work in China, we work in Europe, we work in Southeast Asia. And therefore we do have an international quality system. Next slide. Our services are quite broad. As I said, we do help companies developing their regulatory strategies, but also just jumping in clinical investigations at any stage with the necessary flexibility to help, and especially now during COVID, to help companies still get their reach their objectives in getting some trials started or move forward or finishing them, because that's another thing. So I think that's in a nutshell. I think that was my last slide.
And you went quite fast, Danielle. How has COVID impacted running clinical trials currently?
It has slowed it down initially. We were all taken by surprise. I mean, as I said, we have a team based in China. So we kind of knew what was coming around for Europe because we were stopped way earlier in China than we were in Europe here. But still, it's always like, oh, this happens in China. It's not going to come over here. We now were listening earlier to the news. One European country after the other is deciding more stringent measures, meaning also that the only emergency procedures will be done at the hospitals. So that's going to slow the trials again down. But having said that, we learned from this first wave, and I do think that things in clinical research will change for the good, and we will not. I don't think we will ever go back to the old days. I think the methods that we have we've developed now, that to get trials moving, to keep patients, because we work with devices, so we work with long-term implants, so we can't leave those patients unattended. We find means, remote means to still follow up on those patients and guarantee patient safety. And it learns, it's teaching us a lesson. It's really teaching us a lesson.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to learning more of those firsthand experiences running trials. Interestingly, you were in the place of the origin of the pandemic. That was a bit interesting to hear. We're going to go to the next panelist. It's also a distinct pleasure to introduce Michael Templin, PhD and DABT. He's the Director of Scientific Advisory Services for Charles River Laboratories. Dr. Templin has over 20 years of experience in non-clinical drug development with expertise in non-clinical toxicology, pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacodynamics. In his core position, he provides scientific and program guidance of non-clinical development, provides advice to strengthen and or accelerate non-clinical development programs, and to enhance scientific rigor and regulatory compliance for biotech and pharma clients. We're going to hand it over to Michael to introduce a little bit about Charles River and also talk about how COVID has impacted running clinical trials, perhaps from the perspective of the IND process.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Hope everybody can see the slides, can hear me well. So many of you are probably familiar with Charles River, particularly in the first part of this slide, the basic research. You know, Charles River had for years, since the mid-50s or so, has provided, animal models to be used in both research and drug development. I'm actually in what's shown in the center of this slide, the safety assessment. So I'm the non-clinical toxicologist, or the non-clinical person on this panel. So I deal with a slightly different situation. So these are, either the studies that allow you to get into the, the phase 1 trials, the first time into humans, or support clinical trials as they are running. And while it's always been the case that, this slide represents it well, safety assessment is sort of in the middle of everything. During the, the most recent changes for COVID-19 or, SARS-CoV-2 directly against the virus, we've tried to make sure that safety assessment isn't the pinch point. There's been a large wave of compounds that are trying to move their way through, because at least, from a biology standpoint, they look like they will benefit patients in there. But of course, anytime before you get into human clinical trials, you have to be certain that you can do that as safely as possible. And that's where the safety assessment studies come in. More specifically, what I'm in is what we call the Scientific Advisory Services group at Charles River. It's a fairly small group in comparison. And a significant reason, or main reason, for creating the group about 3 years ago was that toxicology and safety assessment aren't necessarily something that particularly small companies want to invest in early. So for those of you out there, trying to create companies or transition from a university into a drug development situation, or even some cases in large pharmas where they're getting into new technologies and they want to wait a couple of years before they hire people with experience, but they want some data first. And this is where we came in. So we help often with discovery and development strategies. Program design is a big one, how to best move your drug forward. And then even once programs are running, nothing ever goes as planned and there's always surprises. It's definitely been a case with some of the molecules for COVID-19 because they are being moved through so quickly. You need to be able to look at that data real time and be able to make decisions. So as SAS, we've had the privilege of being able to be, sort of on the forefront, so to speak, of what's coming through. Just to the last one, just because everybody's sort of biased by their past. I joined Charles River about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I've been in drug development since about the mid 90s, most of it in small biotech, where you get to do a little bit of everything. I'm a toxicologist by training, so to speak, but I've had to do my fair share of pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and even involved in a few phase 1 clinical trials when I needed to be in order to move things forward. So hopefully it's given me sort of a broad picture and often comes into use that I need to use those skills that I've developed over the years, or at least know what I don't know and find somebody that does, which can be just as important in this business as anything else. The types of molecules I've worked with are oligos, biologics, proteins, peptides, genes and cell therapy, and small molecules, all of which are being brought forward when it comes to SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. So while the objectives of those various molecules are the same, you do have to consider, what's the biology, what's the mechanism, what do we know about past history with these types of molecules, and how do we best design the non-clinical program to move them, again, as everyone expects, as fast as possible, but never losing sight of we need these to assure that when we do go into humans, we have the safest route possible, or where are the gaps in that data, and how do we assure that we don't put clinical trial, either subject or patients, at undue risk. That's probably good for me.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. I'm looking forward to a convergence of all these different expertise in the discussion. So next is also my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Daniela Bota, Vice Dean for Clinical Research and Medical Director of UCI's Center for Clinical Research. Dr. Bota will continue to serve as an Associate Professor for Neurology and as a Medical Director of the Neuro-Oncology Program at the School of Medicine. Dr. Bota is responsible for overseeing the development of clinical research and the new clinical trial business, guiding the development and implementation of, implementation of this important initiative. Her proven leadership and passion for research inspires those around her and will be a great asset in achieving collaborative vision for the future of the clinical trials at UCI. Danielle, it's a pleasure to have you. If you would introduce, the organization a little bit and also the topic, thoughts on the topic.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. I will share my slides and try to stay in time now that I also know that you have a very, very easy to hear way of reminding us. So what I want to introduce to our guest today is the UCI Center for Clinical Research. The UCI Center for Clinical Research was opened in July 2019. And we did not predict COVID, but it was definitely handy at the time of the pandemic to have all our non-cancer clinical trials under one umbrella. So when we think about what do you need to translate clinical research, if you look on this slide, you need a lot of components. And I'm very happy that the speaker before me, Michael, was able to address some of them. Because before you go to the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies, you need to have good research and you need to have the ability to go into the translation part with different type of components, such as a preclinical therapeutic core, a CGMP facility, and the last but not the least, a very good and very strong FDA regulatory unit. So we're able to put all of those elements together at UCI under one umbrella. And right now we have 68 clinical investigators, 73 research professionals, and we are running almost 140 protocols. So, as I said before, it was nice to have this organization when COVID-19 hit Orange County, because we were able to adapt and build a very wonderful, at least from our point of view, COVID-19 clinical trial portfolio. We started in March, when we were one of the very first sites to conduct the research on the utility of remdesivir. We have enrolled the largest number of patients in California for the registration study. On March 31st, we're also opening another study of Aviptadel. We are the first center in the nation to test this drug, very different design. We are looking at the phase 3 for the first study. We are looking at the phase 1 for the second. And on June 10, we opened one of the very first cellular therapy studies coming from cellularity and using NK cells in order to try to boost the immunity of the patients with COVID-19. So the question is, how did we become from a clinical trial unit that was running all type of studies, a COVID-19 unit? And why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because right now we have 19 active studies. We have enrolled almost 130 patients. We have 24 trials in the pipeline and 9 under discussion. And for the people that live around us, probably you do know that even in Orange County, we're starting to see a new spike. So definitely there's going to be more work to do for us. So this is the part that was exciting about COVID-19. What was less excited about this time is that if you have this line as the number of protocols in average, or the percentage of protocols that we open every quarter, in quarter 3, and we work on academic years, so you have to imagine the quarter 3, it's January to March, and quarter 4 is April to June. So in the quarter 3, the number of protocols that we open went down 40%. We have recovered and we're actually running above the baseline, but definitely for the first 3 months of the pandemic, we were severely affected. And you could see also the number of the patients that we recruited was going down initially when we started the pandemic. And now the number of patients is fluctuating, but definitely above what it was the previous year baseline. So why is that the case? Everybody's talking about the phases of opening and closing our towns and our cities, but at the UC system, we also have phases for clinical research. And initially we were on the phase 1 of research at UCI, where only the interventional treatment trials are allowed. We are very fortunate because in other places, such as UCSF, there was no clinical research allowed. We have moved then in the phase 2, and now we are in a modified phase 2, where as you could see, we are running not only interventional studies, but also supportive care, diagnostic, prevention, and we are allowing correlative studies if they are done in conjunction with a standard of care visit. We still cannot do routine observational studies, and we cannot do a lot of other type of clinical research where the risk of the person coming to our clinical site is perceived to be high due to their different other medical conditions or just being at high risk for COVID-19. So there are pluses and minuses. On one side, we're running a lot of clinical trials and enrolling many, many patients trying to find the best treatment for COVID. On the other side, we had to put a lot of work in trying to restart the other aspects of our clinical research enterprise. So I'll stop sharing here and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for that great introduction. Love the information, the data that's provided to put really arms around the impact of COVID. And I wasn't aware you're already running remdesivir and other trials in some of the largest recruiting sites in California. That's phenomenal.
Thank you.
Our last panelist for the general introduction, and we'll jump into some great questions that are already coming in, is my pleasure to introduce Alison Oliva. She's the principal of Comprehensive Clinical Consulting, and I hadn't mentioned she's also in the board of OCRA, Orange County Regulatory Affairs Group, which I'm also part of. Alison is a senior clinical regulatory consultant supporting medical devices, biologics, and pharmaceutical industries. She specializes in strategic planning, project management, clinical operations, study design and implementation, new product launch, including new product launch. Her project history includes cardiovascular and endovascular surgery, interventional cardiology, ophthalmology, gynecology, oncology, tissue regeneration, anti-aging, and aesthetic studies. With that, I'd love to hand it over to Alison for a quick introduction of herself and the topic.
Hi, Luis. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Sounds great.
Luis has the long version of my bio. I want to thank ULP and SBDC. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and I'm happy to follow the rest of the speakers. I think my presentation is very similar and probably overlaps. My business, I've been in the medical device business, med tech business for over 20 years. I started in basic research at UCI and was on staff there for 10 years before segueing into the local industry, and had the pleasure to work in a lot of different therapeutic areas. One of the primary functions of my consultancy business is the design, execution, and submission of clinical trial data. So this topic is near and dear to my heart, and I have active clients that are experiencing all manners of COVID right now. I went looking for some metrics to talk about what this impact had been, not just on COVID trials, but ongoing other trials. In my experience, COVID has changed everything. And as both Danielle said, sometimes for the better. We've had to shift our priorities and shift our traditional thinking into non-traditional methods. So what's been impacted? Certainly all key stakeholders are regulators, hospital resources, site capabilities. We can't get into hospitals to start anything. Training, we can't get on site to do any training. And then how do we assure patient safety with these different impacts to not only resources and personnel, but lack of protective equipment and lack of essential requirements like that big stack of toilet paper there. So what specifically has been impacted? I looked at some of the Q&A, and for my clients, it's been their clinical trial timelines. And that delay is about 4 to 6 months now. So although some of the clinical trials are coming back online now, and we're making forward progress, I have one client where I say, we plan and COVID laughs, because I help with both pre and post-market studies. And we're in Europe right now where we're doing a post-market clinical follow-up study, but we're having difficulty getting traction because of the increase in infection rates again. And supply chain, can we get what we need where it is? And then budget. If your study expands out that extra 6 months, do you have enough in your study budget or your overall, let's say you're a startup, can you carry those burn rates for another 6 months? Informed consent. We are not sure exactly what we have to do to make sure our patients are fully informed. And then remote training. Danielle, Madame Giroud alluded to this. We go on site, we do training. How do we set that up? I have a colleague whose sponsor set up a lab with cameras both on the patient, on the monitors, and on the clinicians themselves. And we are literally up in the middle of the night from California, walking them through the first in human experiences so that we can ensure that they're getting the kind of oversight they need. And then of course, travel. I don't know about you, but I didn't think anything of jumping on a plane and flying to these various centers. And for the first time in my complete career of both research and clinical trials, I have been at home for months. It's very unusual when you're a clinical person to be sitting at your desk at home. So I went and looked for some metrics, and this is one commercial IRB, and they're looking at clinical trial study starts that are down 50 to 80%, and you can see the timeline there. And this is just from WERB clinical trials. Therapeutic areas, usually we have a ton of research in cardiovascular, they're all down. Oncology, down. Now, I don't know if that's because we're shifting to investigate new molecules, or we simply don't want to have those immunocompromised patients being exposed to sick people. When you go in the hospital, there are sick people there, there's germs. I try to avoid those at all costs, not just during a pandemic. What we have seen, of course, is the appropriate increase in infectious disease study starts. And I think in the US, there are over 500 trials ongoing now for some kind of COVID treatment, therapeutic molecules. Surprisingly, only 5% of those trials on vaccines, and the rest are on this redeployment of active agents that can be used therapeutically. What we're finding out works for treating patients that are infected. So the new normal that I have to tell my clients, I had a client call me and say, oh, next year when this is all over. And I kind of smiled and went, well, okay, I'm not as optimistic as you are, because I think the impacts of the pandemic are going to last longer than the initial infection. So if you're a startup, you have to think about your business objectives and your funding. Return on investment. If you're waiting for a tranche of funding, then you might not be hitting that when you think you are. If your first in human clinical trial data is contingent on moving forward, now's the time to revise. I never go into a clinical trial without a plan B, but for this one client, I think we're on plan G now. And we'll try to forecast for Q1 and Q2 of next year, but we really have no idea. Every week we just do risk mitigation. From a patient perspective, that's always first for me, do no harm. How do I ensure? Do I have to Zoom consent all of my patients now? That I have evidence that they truly understand what they're getting themselves into? How do I ask patients to go in a hospital while they might inadvertently be exposed? We treat people who are sick. They already have comorbidities. How do we optimize or minimize how long they're in hospital? What do we do about this virtual training? What about remote evaluations? Daniela alluded to this. We have to go in and see monitoring source verification. Right now under GDPR and US HIPAA rules, that's not allowed. So for me, as a supporter of clinical research, we can't just stop. So it's up to us to find these alternatives for our clients and our sponsor companies so that clinical research, whether it's on COVID or something else, can keep moving forward. I have a few references here that I use to find these metrics. Tufts just came out with an excellent article in Applied Clinical Trials that mirrors everything this panel has said. And I'll kick it back to you, Luis.
Thank you so much, Allison. It's wonderful information. These slides will also be routed to those who registered, and recordings will be provided as well. So why don't we kick off talking about the current research environment for COVID therapies. I think everybody's covered that in a way or two. What are we seeing, just as a brief update, in regards to COVID treatments or innovative diagnostics? Anybody like to take on that? Maybe Daniela, I thought you might be able to share. You know, one of the questions that came in was, what is the most effective primary endpoint for clinical trials for therapeutics for COVID?
That is an excellent question. And it is also a matter of debate what it's a good surrogate endpoint versus what it's a good final endpoint. As you know, Remdesivir was approved based on two measures. One is decreasing the number of hospitalization days, and the other one decreasing the percentage of people going on the ventilator. So those are very good outcomes for hospitalized patients. You can imagine that now if you talk about the COVID positive patients that are not in the hospital, a very good outcome would be definitely the number or the percentage of people that don't end up being admitted. I think that the field is going to change because we are learning more and more that COVID-19 has long-term consequences and long-term complications. And I do think that the future studies will also concentrate on more long-term outcomes. The last but not the least, as we are entering the world of vaccines, we will see immediate outcomes like levels of antibodies, hopefully decreased incidence of infection. But in the long-term goal, we'll also have to look at developmental risk. We'll have to look at neurological complications, which were the most reported right now in the current vaccine. So we are all learning as we are building this plane and flying it.
Building and flying. Thank you very much for that. Another consideration for therapeutics, vaccines, or diagnostics for COVID. Anybody would like to join, participate? Let's see. Maybe I'll ask Danielle.
Well, in medical devices, we have had a few solutions, and obviously the whole race to get these ventilators, sufficient ventilators, and we did see quite a lot of also test kits coming on, poorly tested test kits that under the motto, well, we're in an emergency, we need to get as much on our hands or as much available as we can. People think that they could just bring products to the market that were very little tested, and we've seen really a number of these that the regulators here in Europe have said, hey, come on, we know we're in an emergency situation, but we need a minimum of evidence that this thing works. So there is a misunderstanding of these emergency approvals of companies, saying, well, and also a misunderstanding of what is a product that could benefit the COVID situation. And all of a sudden, a lot of people are trying to find a way to call their medical device also useful as an emergency therapy or diagnostic. So that's a little bit what we've seen here is that we are in an emergency situation, but that doesn't mean that we need to cut short to get patient safety assured and usefulness of the devices.
Thank you so much for that, Danielle. I was actually was going to address. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Just to jump in real quick, add a little bit from the non-clinical. A couple of significant points have been made. One, there are a fair number of drugs that they're not really being repurposed in that sense, in the traditional sense. It is, of course, COVID is a significant disease, and the inflammation and those things that are associated with it. And there's a fair number of drugs out there that have the potential to be effective. What has confused and frustrated some of the sponsors that I've dealt with is maybe they're in phase 1 or they're in phase 2 in a different indication, and they want to take their drug straight over and go into COVID patients. And while the FDA or the regulatory agencies haven't said no, you absolutely can't do it, it's more of raising questions, and some of these have come up. how are you going to use that drug differently in that patient population? And do you have the data to be able to support that? And in many cases, again, while we all want to move fast, we have to move safely. So there has been, several cases where people have tried to, sort of say, yeah, it's an emergency, but you can't use that as an excuse for not having the data. So there are cases where companies have needed to go back and look at a different dose level or a different dose level or a regimen or something to say, because this is how you want to use it now in these patients. And that data still needs to be there, whether it's a drug or a device or anywhere else, you have to be able to back it up with something. And that's where I've seen some sponsors get frustrated and not necessarily fully think through the process of doing this.
I'll
Thank you very
echo
much.
what Michael is saying. We do have commonly sponsors coming to UCI and to our investigators even before they submit an IND, and then or an IDE, and we work with them through the process. Yes, it is an emergency. Yes, there are treatments that were studied in diseases that are relevant. If we are studying ARDS in COVID-19 infection, I don't think that in my opinion, it's okay if we have studied it in that indication in general, and now we are applying it to COVID-19. But when you come with drugs that were used from anywhere from psychiatry to vascular diseases to cancer, just to name a very few that are coming through my mind, immunology, inflammation, I think that the level that the FDA is asking, it's higher. I will also defer to Danielle and to Alison, but we have seen initial emergency approvals for diagnostic devices that were given. And then now we have to move to the level, at least for the hospital labs, of a CLIA certification. And many of the devices that have got the emergency authorization are having difficult times making it to a CLIA.
We see some cases over here in Europe too, where devices in a panic were approved, and then finally the labs discovered that they weren't that specific and that accurate, and regulators quickly reacted though. We don't need more problems.
Yeah. Well, to expand on that, there was a question here asking, what about a company that's thinking about initiating discussions with FDA to start a clinical trial with a COVID therapy or vaccine? What advice do you give them to get, IND or green light? And have you seen any rejections, and what was the cause?
So yes, the answer will be yes and yes and yes. There is a big question if you want to move on a vaccine, and that's a discussion that I had with many startup companies. We already have 4 or 5 large companies that are already on phase 3. If you are trying to treat for the same indication, you have to understand how will you differentiate as compared with the companies that are already ahead of you. And like always, the problem is how much safety data exists with the vaccine. Is a phase 1 appropriately planned? Is this a platform that has been used before safely, or it's a completely new concept?
Thank you, Daniela. Anybody would like to add? Allison?
Yeah, Luis, I have to say that in the first month after the general stay-at-home order for the entire U.S., I think because FDA didn't have to go to meetings, they were very responsive. But, they've been assigned critical mission only now, and a lot of them have turned their attention to the review of these early phase solutions, the EUAs. And so there was one question about, what is the responsiveness of FDA been? For my clients in pre-market, it's been surprisingly good. And even in the post-market situation, we've had legal orders to conduct these clinical trials in a specified timeline. they weren't planning on a pandemic when they issued those orders. And I have to say, overall, the agency's been very useful and helpful with us. I don't know, Danielle, have you had the same interactions with them as far as study starts or studies that are required, like the post-market clinical follow-ups in support of CE marking?
It depends which country. There are countries that are very slow. They're home-based, but these were also countries that were hard hit by the first wave of COVID, and they have actually not really fully recovered. I think they are still very silent. Spain is one of them. But other countries are trying to, keep up, keep these activities going, while the rest of the team is focusing on COVID. So in general, yes, but the fact that here in Europe, I don't know about if it's worse than in the US, or a lot of organization and a lot of government agencies also oblige the people to do home-based, and a lot of companies have actually not reinstated the office work again. That slowed down somehow a little bit too, especially also for the notifying bodies doing the assessments. They can't go out for auditing,
We found,
on-site auditing.
yeah, we found in Europe that the ethics committees were coming back online and were willing to review your application, but in some situations, other parts of the clinical trial review process, like contract review, we had one group tell us they had a 1-year backlog and the study was only intended to be 6 months long. And I get this email in the middle of the night. So by 5 a.m., I call a Zoom meeting, and by the time we're all up in US, we have to figure out where else we can go to keep this moving forward. And certainly because we're speaking with Europe every day, we're aware of what those reinfection rates are doing. Some clinicians just simply aren't taking cases in any elective procedures on any regular basis right now, still to this day, never mind the new closures that are going back in place. So we certainly found that here. I mean, we couldn't even do a cadaver lab at Cedars-Sinai, and the patient had already, was already on the other side of COVID, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was gonna actually, there's a great segue for a next topic, which is talking about other than COVID, clinical trials moving forward. Maybe we could start the discussion with what about trials that were going on and now the follow-ups have been impossible to have because patients are not going in for monitoring visits? How has the industry adapted to the current situation where it's not advisable to bring these compromised patients in?
Well, Danielle alluded to this at the very beginning, and she said in the medical device industry, especially if you have an implant, I mean, you can do a drive-by chest x-ray, but you need to go into the radiology department to get a CT scan or some advanced imaging. So it's not always possible. And honestly, just getting into a hospital these days is still very difficult. You get COVID tested before, you get COVID tested after. So it's definitely still a blockage in the clinical trial continuum. And I think it's going to be that way for a while.
I would say that COVID-19 has made us innovate. The use of telemedicine and now the use of systems where, coming from different companies, I don't want to name one over the other, where the hospital or the clinic can move at home and you have a lot of the monitoring devices available at the patient's home. are helping us capture many research points that otherwise would be missed. However, we cannot have CTs and MRIs on patients' houses. So in the end, we are trying always to measure benefit with risk. Many patients that need this type of advanced imaging do have clinical visits to monitor their conditions. So trying to minimize the patient exposure remains a very important factor.
That's what we have done also for ongoing studies, and also a lot of cardiology studies. We did provide a risk management plan for the patients of what visits were absolutely needed, whereby the risk of, getting into a COVID environment did not outweigh the risk of not having the assessment for, because they did have a long-term cardiology implant that needed follow-up and needed adjustment of the treatment maybe or so. So we did do that for each separate trial. And yes, we are trying to adjust the endpoints as much as we can, so but they still remain meaningful. And we try to do as much remote as possible to indeed, as said by Daniela, bring the assessments to the patients or locally, or and set up indeed like questionnaires that the patients can do it from home, not bring them into the hospital and so on. And these are the type of things that I've been preaching, like, why do you bring in a patient for a questionnaire with all the technology we have? And you can say, okay, they're older patients and they're not so good with computers and so on. And now it forces us, and we do see that there is a community out there, and the people who don't have the technology or are not so averse with the technology, well, a neighbor helps them or that one helps them. So, so it works finally if we are insistent enough and really have no choice. It works. So now we see that if we will have the choice, maybe we will not go back to the old system, because some of the remote models work very well and can save costs.
I completely agree. A couple of weeks ago, Luis talked about the Orange County Regulatory Association annual meeting, and we had Eric Pittman, who's in charge of more than half of the BIMO district. And he was so excited, he ran and showed us the projector that they're using for these remote regulatory assessments. And a couple of our colleagues said, where do we get one of those? Because that's the perfect way to set your center up for remote monitoring, right? If they can show us what they have written down, we can do source data verification, and we can ensure that we can keep collecting the data as the patients come in safely. So some of these things we've been forced to do are some of the things we probably should have been doing for quite a while now.
I absolutely agree. We should have been doing them for quite a while.
So in terms of that topic of how the future may look like, do you foresee patient recruitment being a significant challenge in running trials for non-COVID therapies?
I have a sister who works in the Kaiser program. She's a non-treating pharmacist. And what she has done, as well as many other of our larger hospital systems, is segregate clinical treatment from clinical trial. And by doing that, literally moving those whole units out of a treatment area where there could be this inadvertent risk of contamination or exposure. And because patients are afraid, I mean, patients are going to ask you more than once, why am I in this trial? What is it? What do you know about it? Do you have those safety data? I wrote in the chat a while ago, show me the data. It's like, show me the money. And I think patients are really getting smarter. They go online, they do a lot of research themselves. So I think it is going to be impacted. And they're also going to consider, do I need to have this intervention? Do I need to have this therapy right now? Or is it something where I can wait until hospitals have a better handle on their infection rates or their internal processes to keep me safe? So that's what I'm seeing in terms of recruitment right now.
It really depends, Louis, on the type of device, on the type of treatment that we have. Here in Europe, there are a lot of physicians that we've seen after the first wave of COVID, and I guess this is the same in the US, whereby we see patients in a much sicker state coming to the hospital because they were afraid to go into the hospital. We don't want to get into that with the second wave. And a lot of like neurologists or cardiologists and so on, they are really saying to the hospitals, we have to segregate it and make sure that we can continue to treat these patients, because we don't want to go back to the situation we had in the first wave. We want to be able to continue treating those patients for chronic disease or a disease that can quickly aggravate. Don't forget that there is a level of stress that aggravates diseases as well, and it's with everybody.
Yeah, I will echo that we will continue to do clinical trials irrespective of the conditions, as long as clinical trials can be done. But that's going to be, like we have seen on the last wave, a difference between conducting cancer clinical trials, interventional studies for patients that have no other options, maybe they're going on a phase 1, versus with no judgment being made, studies on the new dermatological fillers. So there's going to be a level of risk that probably will impact patients' wish to come and be part of the study. Studies where you treat degenerative severe neurological disorders, from stroke to Lou Gehrig's disease. Patients, in my experience, are coming no matter how concerned and how scared they are, and it's our duty to keep them safe.
Yeah, that's all great to hear, because at least from a non-clinical perspective, things are still moving through at a fairly high rate. So while obviously SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 caused a wave to go through that we're focused on that, but there is still a fair number of IND programs that are currently in progress. So either we're going to have a significant backlog if these all have to stop, or we're just going to all have to figure out how we can deal with the new world we're in and move them forward. Because to date, the non-clinical world, well, we've had to adjust, obviously. How do you deal with some people working from home, and how do you separate and give people space while they're at work, and how do you keep them safe? How do you ship things around the world when things are somewhat restricted? But in some ways, there was a slide, everything changed, true, but some things didn't change. Small companies are still in a hurry. Big companies have a lot of plans that they need to move forward. And those clinical trials are going to be needed. We just have to figure out how to survive in the world that we have in front of us.
That's a great point, Michael. And so your estimation is that there is a continued momentum of new molecules and new technologies that are continually moving forward, and that's phenomenal. There was a question that somebody asked from the audience saying, has the non-clinical research been impacted too by COVID-related potential delays?
Yeah, definitely. When everything, the first couple of weeks, we had, again, the same challenges. Essential workers, who can be there, who can't, how do we make sure people are safe at work? Obviously, shipments, shipping things even within the US was difficult. Things were delayed. If you were, a lot of small companies have drug made in India or China, and obviously that got directly impacted. So there were a few weeks where things were definitely difficult, but we're working through them as far as Charles River. Other non-clinical CROs are as well. And again, the drug companies are trying to figure out how to do this as well. Team meetings now occur by Zoom. There are some people working in the labs and doing those things. So it definitely had an impact. And there were some waves and some slowdowns, but I'd say right at this point, it's been as busy as I've seen it in quite some time. So it's moving forward. We're just figuring out new ways to do it.
Maybe this is the first time that I disagree with one of our panelists, but in the academic arena, the non-clinical research is severely affected. And it's related for our graduate students, for our postdocs, to the sheer ability to share the same research space while keeping the social distancing that it's mandated. So our labs right now, by example, at UCI, they have a 25% occupancy. I have a medium-sized lab to develop brain tumor drugs, and basically people are working on shifts. And some of our very ambitious graduate students are working very late hours in the night and trying to do everything that they can outside of the lab. But there are lots of questions about how we're going to be fulfilling NIH grants or even industry contracts.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've seen some of that as well. I mean, it hasn't hit as far as the non-clinical world goes, because that's, the basic research, but there is, I hope it won't be too severe, but there's going to be a bit of a gap. So it's been unfortunate. Some of the universities, graduate students, I couldn't imagine being, your last year of a PhD and they tell you you can't go into lab and do research. That's got to be a really tough situation to deal with.
Medical schools and other therapeutic schools are having the same issue. They're saying you need to take an extra quarter because we can't meet in person. We can't teach you hands-on. But Michael, you said something that was a huge concern, which I think we've gotten over. But when the U.S. finally went on closed borders, we had about 6 weeks of raw material inventory for the med tech biopharma industry as a whole, because as you said, a lot of our raw materials and even, agents, molecules come from outside the US now. And so the supply chain had an extreme interruption, and we didn't know if we were going to be able to manufacture and or import the materials we needed to treat people during this. So never mind a clinical trial, we're talking about therapies that are ongoing, and competing with that was resources, both personnel, staffing, and materials for clinical trials. If you're waiting on getting a molecule from somebody to put through the safety assessment or the animal studies, those first steps before you get to human clinicals, that took a hit too. And I don't know if it's caught up or not. Can you speak to that, Michael and Daniela?
I just go real quick. I mean, the ones I've seen, yes, but then again, I don't know how many got delayed and they transitioned over to different programs. In some cases, there probably were some programs went forward because they had the reagents and they had the drug already made and they had things ready to go, where that became the factor that moved it forward. So unfortunately, there probably is some that are out there that are waiting for resources in order to move forward. And those times are going to be difficult to deal with. But
thank you for those comments. One question I wanted to make sure we covered is, as people are considering designing clinical trials, and we talked about the long-lasting effects of this pandemic, should they be considering basically as much as possible remote monitoring, perhaps lower number of patients when there's you think the regulators are going to be expecting that and open to modifications moving forward given the current circumstances in the long term?
I do have several clients that have post-market surveillance orders from FDA, And they have continued to speak with the agency about exactly that, Luis, is we've given you pre-market data, we have a commercialization clearance, de novo, and you still want more data. That's great. But considering our situation, how can we fulfill what the agency's looking for in terms of safety and efficacy data while still continuing to run our company? So it's been a bit of a trade-off. They've certainly understood on timelines, and my clients are in negotiation about numbers of patients, what that post-market cohort needs to look like, and when the data can realistically be captured. These aren't necessarily emergent cases, but for us, sometimes they're last options for venous access. So the patients are already immunocompromised, and by putting them off more, like Danielle and Daniela said, the patients not coming to the hospital actually creates a condition where they're worsened and not getting the treatment they need. So I think the agency, as far as my experience, has been amenable to that, just under all the considerations that they didn't have when they issued those post-market surveillance orders.
Okay. Daniela, you were going to add?
Yeah, I think on our end here, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
They're very similar names.
I know. Post-market surveillance continues, although everybody seems to understand notified bodies and so on when it's delayed. Obviously, it is difficult to sell to a notified body that you have sold, I don't know how many devices on the one hand, and on the other hand, you say, but we couldn't do our post-market surveillance study. Then there is something that is not going right there. So, but in general, yeah, post-market surveillance, it can be delayed a little bit or slower setup. Also sometimes due to devices that cannot be shipped. But it usually comes also in line with a market that is being started slower or slowing down.
Thank you, Daniela. Daniela?
I would say that the future of clinical trials and the success in clinical trials will depend on our ability to do everything that can be done remotely. It is more convenient for the subject, it is safer, but it also requires an investment. So time will tell us if the investment is worthwhile, from making sure that all the clinical trial records are included in our electronic medical records. So when you audit a site, you don't need a projector, you just need access to the EMR. To, again, those device kits that can live on patients' houses and they can be remotely monitored. So being a virtual site and being ready for virtual studies, it's going to remain a key differentiator, at least in my opinion.
And is the consensus yes? Do incorporate this remote as much as possible moving forward for clinical trials designs? That's a consensus, huh?
Absolutely. We were already actually starting with it because with the new regulations in Europe imposing or even reinforcing more and more post-market surveillance studies, trying to reduce costs, and remote is not necessarily more expensive. It can actually even reduce the cost as well, the cost of monitors traveling and so on. So we were already implementing slowly some tools, electronic tools and so on. And it has just being accelerated with the COVID situation. So, and I don't think we'll go, I really think that remote monitoring is there to be improved. A lot of companies, EDC companies and so on, are working on excellent tools. I have now launched a battle with the European Commission on, sorry, aligning, it is getting late for me, aligning the requirements for electronic informed consent because that's still different in one country and another, and that could also be a help. And then work on those tools for, especially for patients who need long-term follow-up with a quality of life questionnaires. Don't let a patient come into the hospital for a stupid quality of life questionnaire. A lot can be done over the phone and with ePro or nice tools that are user-friendly for patients. And
Danielle,
and
do you
again,
remember when we had to fight just to have one telephone follow-up?
yeah.
And now we're going to
The new norm.
all telephone follow-ups if we can. I mean, it's exactly what you said. It's accelerated some efficiencies we would have loved to implement a long time ago. And I think there are efficiencies.
Yeah,
And
that's-
I was astonished because in our ISO 14155 working group, FDA is participating. They really come at every meeting. And really, the ones who are pushing the most to consider remote monitoring and having accesses to can also, I mean, it's the US FDA who said you should put in your ISO that electronic signature of the informed consent is possible. I mean, I loved it. So it's there. Okay, it's done on a risk-based assumption of collecting accurate data. But we literally, even in Asia, where in China, you can't hardly do anything by phone or an email. Physicians, you have to really go and visit them. We now do remote monitoring, where we do source document verification with somebody else on the other screen showing us what's going on there. So it is, you really see a shift in, everybody understands that we need to move forward, that science needs to continue, and solutions are being found and accepted.
That's phenomenal. We're wrapping up closer to the end here. I was going to ask a couple of very specific or more niche questions. Michael, for you, the need to move fast has been highlighted through the COVID pandemic, drug development. Are there opportunities to minimize the number of non-clinical studies or study scope for development of treatments?
Yeah, there's always the opportunity to do that. I'd say it's more of and same thing, trying to add, other endpoints within studies so you run fewer studies in total. The primary questions are still the same. I said, to get into clinical trial, you have to understand what's the dose you're going to start with and what you need to monitor in those first human studies. So how you do it can vary. So people are definitely getting more efficient and more effective in what they can include in those studies and how they get the data moved out. We're also trying to cut down the time that it takes to report some of it out. So it's hard. It's a hard difference between scope versus just trying to make us more efficient. Once you realize when you get into those time restraints and things that you can't do, you realize you could do things faster. You just got used to doing them a different way. And that's, to me, that's going to be the biggest difference, is just to make us re-examine how we're doing the same tasks, but doing them more efficiently.
Thank you. Maybe Daniela, you could maybe address the current sort of state of multi-purpose or multi-phase studies or flexible design in studies.
That's a loaded question. As mentioned before by Danielle and Alison, we have come a long, long way from having to go traditionally phase 1, 2, 3 and post-marketing, and from the 3x3 design to adaptive designs to umbrella designs to basket design. So there's a lot of innovation that's taking place right now. And it's true that COVID-19 is pushing this innovation forward. I started talking about Remdesivir, which is the first study of its sort, was the collaboration between NIAID and Gilead. But on that structure on which one drug was tested, at least another 4 drugs are were tested or are currently tested in combination with remdesivir or in comparison with remdesivir. So this way you are minimizing the need for control groups because you can use one set of controls for multiple sets of therapies. And I think that that's going to also be here to stay.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a kind of alphabet soup of different trial designs, but that innovators should be aware of because there are tremendous opportunities to make the process efficient. Danielle, we couldn't close without talking about 14155. Any new trends that are worthwhile mentioning for the audience to keep a lookout or adaptations given the current pandemic?
No, well, I did bring out that document. I published it in July, so we were, but it was already written before the pandemic, so we didn't really write the ISO 14155 with the pandemic in our mind. It's there. We do see still some different opinions, as I said earlier, where FDA is pushing for considering remote monitoring and so on. We had some heavy debates between European regulatory authorities that are on our committee and FDA. Japan is more a little bit quiet and walks along. They have their own thoughts. I would say that yes, the European regulators are somewhat more conservative still, but I do think they're catching up. On the other hand, yeah, ISO 14155 hammers more on a robust study design based on statistics and so on, which in Europe, unfortunately, there was always this thing, oh, we'll do a 50-patient trial and that should be enough. Well, now it's really clear in the document. But yeah, the document was not really written with COVID-19 mind, but there is room to apply the requirements of the document and be, as I call, heuristic in our approach of finding solutions during COVID-19. There's room.
Thank you, Danielle. Closing one for Alison. Alison, how has in the current light of the discussion and the current pandemic, how do you see the interactions between industry and FDA evolving? You've talked a lot about how good conversations you have with the FDA, and we've mentioned the recent events. Any words of wisdom or advice in that area?
Get in touch with them. The sooner is the better, always. I have been pleasantly surprised at how responsive they've been. At one point, we were ping-ponging every 24 hours with them. We weren't getting substantive responses, but they were responding. And you know, Luis, from our discussions with them a couple of weeks ago, they've all been redeployed. So they're keeping business going. They're making scientific decisions. They're trying not to be sidelined by any of the other nonsense going on. So I would just say get in touch with them and have the conversation with them earlier rather than later. When you're still talking at the beginning of Michael's timeline, go in and ask them, what are their expectations? If you're going to use a surrogate endpoint, make sure they're in agreement with you, because once you put your toe in the water with an IND or an IDE, this is what I tell, especially starting out clients, you're either in or you're out. There's no in between. Once you start a clinical trial, you're committed. Yeah. So try to make those decisions up front, whether you have the stomach to continue, particularly during the pandemic.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much for that. We have just a few minutes. We covered so much. I thank you immensely for sharing the experiences and your expertise. We've promised to cover impacts of COVID on clinical trial pathways, and I think we've certainly covered a lot, kind of sporadically, and we've addressed all the questions from the audience. So I'd like to just open it up. Anybody have any parting words of wisdom or nuggets of wisdom for the audience as they embark in the clinical research and the deployment of science?
I have a question for Danielle. Mm-hmm. what do you think about not postponing EU MDR and IVDR any further? What do you think about the Commission's decision about that?
You know, postponing, I don't know what would be worse, is postponing or not postponing. Because postponing is just saying to everybody, oh, you have time, and everybody is going back in the race. And so finally you have a regulation that needs to come out, and there are some good points to that regulation to come out. There are some fine tuning to be done, definitely. I mean, they went all way overboard on some things, but I don't think postponing further is going to be any solution. What they need to do is just speed up at the European Commission and make sure that more notified bodies are being accredited. That's being slowed down. Find solution to do also audits by the notified bodies and so on. Find solutions and adapt to COVID. Yeah, I'm mitigated. I don't think postponing more is going to help. It's just giving everybody, oh, we have time again, and people don't get into action. At some point, you need to bite the bullet.
So thank you for bringing that question out. It's hot off the press. Any other sort of final concluding thoughts from the rest of the panelists?
I would say don't hesitate, because a lot of companies now are like, oh, should we start the study or should we wait until this pandemic is over? If you wait, we don't know when it's going to come over. Just find solutions. There are solutions. Don't stick by the problem. Go for the solution.
That's great. Daniela?
I would say that though we are going through a very hard time with the pandemic, we still have the unanswered questions that we had before the pandemic. We still don't have effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease. We still haven't cured cancer. We still need a lot of devices to keep our blood vessels open and patent. And this is just scratching the surface. So I urge everybody to continue, because I do see as a physician, people dying in the same numbers and maybe even in higher numbers, because we are slowing everything down, including the patient's wish to come to the emergency rooms or to get treatments from their primary care doctors. So let's go back there and do our best, like we all try.